You can listen to Jeremy regularly on the Kirsch Lecture Lockdown University series, which many of us have been enjoying through lockdown. And if you want to know how to join it, if you email me, I'll let you know. So, Jeremy, you've got a student on listening, Jeremy Moore, who was at Carmel College.
Oh, I don't think I'd recognize him. It's been so long, but anyway, that's
so he'll expect the same high standard that he received at Carmel. And I'd like to pass on now to our rabbi, who's going to chair the evening, but we are all thoroughly looking forward to listening to you.
Thank you so much, Aviva, and welcome, Rabbi Rosen. It's so good to have you. It's really, I feel this is some fresh face for us, for our community, even though many of you may have known you already from your past here from the UK. Let me just introduce you, for those that do not know a little bit your background. But I love first of all the title, which is amazing, which is so important, focusing on the Jewish belief in general. We're all looking very much to hear you, but just a little bit about you. You were born in Manchester, and of course, your father is Rabbi Koppel Rosen, the founder of Carmel College, which you later on was also continued as a principal in that school. You studied in Be'er Yaakov Yeshiva, which is interesting, which I have studied there too, but probably many years later on with Rav Moshe Shmuel Shapira, when he passed away too, in my years when I was there. So it's maybe 15 years ago, something like that. I would maybe after, I would love to hear maybe one or two stories about Rabbi Shapira. You have an interesting background because you went to Merkaz Arav, which is a more I would say modern, and the Mir Yeshiva. You got a smicha from Chaim Shmulevitz from Ponevezh. And again, you have a kind of both backgrounds. Very religious. Ponevezh was very religious, and of course you went to Cambridge, and you graduated in moral science in Cambridge University. You were the rabbi in 1966 of a community in Zimbabwe, and then a rabbi in New Lands Hebrew congregation in Glasgow. Later on, you went to became a rabbi in the U.S. and I mean United States, not the U.S. United Synagogue, but I understand you were a rabbi in the U.S. But when you offered a position in the United Synagogue, when the merge of the Western Synagogue became the Western Marble Arch, you finished, or you said goodbye to that rabbinical position, and you continued on in education, which is the most important. Educate the next generation, continuing with a beautiful and very powerful organization called Yakar Kehila, and continuing to Tel Aviv, which also continue. I've never heard about it, even though my father has a community in Tel Aviv. I would love to hear also about that too. Continued Yakar community in Tel Aviv in Israel. So and now is the last appointment. In 2009, you accepted the position as the rabbi of the Persian Jewish Center of Manhattan, which of course involves many educational roles. And as Aviva said before, you are a lecturer in Kirsch Foundation and Lockdown University. So without further ado, Rabbi Rosen, please, looking forward to hear the words of wisdom. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You could have dispensed with the introduction, but that's very sweet of you. I have devoted my life in Jewish education to try and bridge the gap between rationalism and mysticism. And I have always tried to defy specific categories because I find that categories are very disturbing, and therefore my view is the view of a maverick. And my problem has always been that from studying philosophy, particularly linguistic philosophy, where language matters so much, one is faced with the challenge of analyzing words. What does a word actually mean? And conversely, from, we'll call it a mystical religious point of view, words are not half as important as the experience, the feeling. And many people find difficulty deciding where they fit on this spectrum of absolute belief on the one hand, absolute cynicism on the other, of passionate commitment without thought, or thought without passionate commitment. How do we find a balance? That's always been the challenge. And particularly when we have just come out of Yom HaAtzmaut in Israel, we have the question of where do we belong? Who are we? Whether it's in the diaspora or in Israel, these are all challenges that I think we need to think about, but very often I find people don't even bother to think about and very often discard. And so one of my challenges has always been, how do I reach out to understand and to explain where I am religiously? We're going to come shortly to Shavuot. And Shavuot is going to be the anniversary of reading the Torah, receiving the Torah on Sinai. And it's always been regarded as a fundamental principle that Torah min hashamayim, Torah comes from heaven. But as you know, Louis Jacobs, who to my mind was a lovely, wonderful person, was thrown out of the community basically because he said, of course I believe in Torah min hashamayim, in Torah from heaven. The question is, what do you mean by Torah and what do you mean by heaven? Because if you stop and think about it for a moment, Moshe Rabbeinu came down from Mount Sinai with 2 tablets of stone. He didn't come down with an ox cart carrying the whole of the Torah written on stone or even on parchment. And yet, it is a principle of our tradition that everything that we have in the Torah comes from heaven. But what was the mechanism of this transmission? How did it actually work? What language was it in? Was it extrasensory perception? Was it filtered through Moshe's brain or was it not? We cannot know. So it's very easy for somebody to say, it's a principle that you must believe that every word of the Torah comes from heaven. But then the question is, what do you mean by belief? And here's an interesting issue. There is no command in the Torah which says you must believe. The first of the 10 commandments doesn't say, mitzvah la'amin, you have an obligation to believe that God has given us the whole of the Torah, or that God exists for that matter. And yet, it is a fundamental of Judaism that there is a God. But the question is, how do we get to that God? After all, some people are intellectually minded and some people are not intellectually minded. We have a difference in Judaism between what we call emunah pshuta, simple faith. Yes, I believe, glory, hallelujah, don't disturb me. If you'd have stopped the average Tuvia the milkman in his cart somewhere in Eastern Europe and say, do you believe in God? He'd say, yes, I believe. But what would that mean? What was it? And therefore, we have this dissonance between, in my view, a pre-Greek version of Judaism. The Torah is pre-Greek. The term belief, emunah, literally means to be strong. Moshe's hands were held up during the battle against Amalek, and his hands were emunah ad Bo Hashem. They were strong until the evening. They weren't believing in anything. Or a nurse is omenet, somebody you trust, not necessarily believe in theological terms. And so you have these words like emunah, belief, which in the pre-Greek world did not mean the same thing as in the post-Greek world. Another example is emet, the word for truth. In Hebrew, it starts with the first letter of the alphabet, the last letter of the alphabet, middle, emet. But the truth is that emet is used in the Torah primarily it's used empirically. Im emet nachon hadavar nestar to'ava b'Yisrael. Is it true that this happened? What is truth? There are lots of different truths. And it depends if you take a truth, which means there can only be one, or a truth in which there can be many. For example, it is truth for the Kohen that he functions in the temple. It is not truth for a Yisrael that he functions in the temple. For a Yisrael to function in the temple is going against truth, and for a Kohen to function outside of the temple is denying his truth. There are different truths. So when you look at the Torah in its pre-Greek sense, it is primarily an expression of feeling. In modern terms, we would call it existential. I feel that this is what matters to me. I don't need proofs of how it matters to me. The notion of proof started with Greece. I don't think anybody asked Moshe Rabbeinu for proof. He wanted an experience. When after the golden calf, he wanted to be reassured, and God put him in a cleft. This was just continuing his need for reassurance ever since the burning bush. It wasn't asking for proof of the existence. And indeed, the term to prove something is a strange term. Imagine you arrive at the airport and your parents are there waiting for you, and you run towards them, and your mother says, "You've got to believe I'm your mother." That would only mean something if somebody had suggested she wasn't your mother. But otherwise, you don't say, "You've got to believe I'm your mother," or "I'm your father," or "You're my son." So my personal experience of Torah is what I would call a pre-Greek experience. Once Greek philosophy enters into the equation, we have a totally different way of thinking. It's the foundation of the whole of Western society. Western society is predicated on the Greek thinkers. And the Greek thinkers were essentially scientists. They wanted evidence. They experimented. They wanted to find out what the right way of doing things was. They were struggling with ideas, arguing and debating, not unlike the arguing and debating that goes on in the Torah itself. And that has influenced the whole of the Western world. Because when Christianity emerged, and that's another story of how it emerged, it was primarily a Greek system, the system of culture of the Roman Empire. And they were philosophical, and they introduced the idea of what we call theology. What's the difference between philosophy and theology? Essentially, philosophy is saying, how can I use my brain to work things out? And I don't know where my philosophy is going to take me. It could take me in any direction whatsoever. On the other hand, theology starts off with its conclusion and then sets out to prove them. Now, the greatest theologian in Judaism was Maimonides. And Maimonides, 1,000 years ago, was a follower of Aristotle with some modification for Plato. And he'd be influenced by the fact that the Muslim theologians had rediscovered Greek philosophy and adapted it to Islam. And then the Jews took that philosophy and translated it from Islam into Latin through Spain. And that's how the Christian world rediscovered Aristotle and Plato. And so, whether it was the theologians of Islam, the theologians of Christianity, they were developing systems of theology in which they said, you have to have a theological structure. If you don't have a theological structure, what kind of religion are you? And in response to that, Moses Mendelssohn wrote his famous book, The Guide to the Perplexed. which was written in Arabic, and it was written for a scholarly audience, as he says so in the audience, in the introduction, not for the ordinary person. And it was an attempt to reconcile theology with Judaism to show that we are as good as any of the others. But at the same time, Maimonides realized that your average person isn't a theologian. Anybody opens a book of Aristotelian theology today, it's gobbledygook, difficult to understand what's going on. It doesn't make much sense. It's not much relevant. I want to tell you an amusing joke of something that happened to me when I was in yeshiva in Mir after I graduated. In Mir, they said to me, look, we know you've come from university, which we're not very happy with, and we know you studied philosophy, which we're not very happy with, but you're here to learn and you're here to commit, and we're happy to have you so long as you're a good masmid and you study and you don't disrupt us. At the end of my time there, when I came to get smicha, the Rosh Yeshiva said to me, look, there's something I don't understand. I believe that in the time you were here, you have said that we can't learn much from Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed because he based himself on Aristotle. And Aristotle is no longer the way we argue intellectually and philosophically. And as a result, this is not going to help. You need to jump to modern philosophy. And the Rosh Yeshiva said, I'll prove to you you're wrong. I said, good, I want to hear that. You're wrong because you'll agree that Aristotle was you'll agree that the Rabbanim, the rabbis of the Mishnah, were greater than the rabbis of the Gemara, and the rabbis of the Gemara were greater than the rabbis who came after them. So if the Jewish rabbinic tradition has gone from high to low, the same must be true of the Greek philosophical tradition. In other words, that Aristotle must have been a much greater man than anybody now, years and years and years later, trying to be a philosopher. And therefore, it's simply not possible. So here you had somebody who was one of the greatest religious minds of the generation, who had difficulty comprehending the difference between a philosophical approach and a non-philosophical approach. So that when you then come into this century in which we live, we are divided essentially between a very powerful Haredi world, a world in which the principles of Maimonides, the Shloshesrei Ikarim, the 13 fundamental principles, are regarded as the core of Jewish theology. And there's no doubt that they are. But the question is, what do you mean by a principle? Is a principle something you have to already accept? Or is a principle something you have to work towards trying to understand? Many of us struggle to understand things. So what has emerged is a kind of a statement which says, you must believe this, that, and the other, but you mustn't challenge this, that, and the other. And because it seems to be either one or the other, this is why so many people nowadays have difficulty understanding many of these principles about life after death, about the Messiah, about resurrection, about the nature of Torah, the nature of Nevuah, all these things. Now, your rabbi mentioned Ber Yaakov. When I was in Ber Yaakov, the mashgiach was a great rabbi called Volber, Rabbi Volber, who studied with my father actually in Mir in the old country. I did Rabbi Moshe Shapiro, who was a roommate of my father in Mir. And I went to Rav Volber and said, Rav Volber, please help me. One of the ikarim of Maimonides is that God is a perfect unity. I don't understand what a perfect unity is. What's the difference between a perfect unity and an ordinary unity? And how can I comprehend it? To which he said, don't worry, young man, don't worry. Keep on trying to find a solution. But meanwhile, until you find a solution, You carry on learning, carrying on studying, trying to be a good person. And that wisdom was phenomenal. And that's what I view the role of a teacher is. The role of the teacher is not necessarily to give the answers, but to give the tools that enable people to come to their own conclusions. And it's because of this that I have always disliked categorization. What kind of a Jew are you? Are you Haredi? Are you Orthodox, non-Orthodox, middle of the road, conservative, reform, liberal, etc.? I don't think anybody ever asked Moshe Rabbeinu to define a Jew. Moshe Rabbeinu presented a constitution. And this is our constitution, and we're committed to our constitution. Some people do more of our constitution, and some people do less than our constitution. We have just had a parsha talking about Metzorat, Sara'at, which is leprosy, but not in the sense that we know it. And we traditionally say that this is associated with gossip, with Lashon Hara. And it's a core of the Torah, Lashon Hara. But at the same time, we are all aware that within the most religious communities, Lashon Hara is going on all the time. Even in yeshivas, the followers of one Rosh Hashiva are fighting with the followers of another Rosh Hashiva. One Rebbe's Hasidim insult another Rebbe's Hasidim. Everybody's gossiping about everybody else. Is she a good shidduch or a bad shidduch? What's in the family? What's this? All these people who are outwardly very, very frum are not keeping a fundamental principle of the Torah. But if, God forbid, you eat gebroks on Pesach, or you're not having glut kosher, you're not a proper Jew. And everybody is busy trying to categorize other people. And I think this is a disaster. I understand why communities need to be cohesive. And each community is cohesive in a different way. Satmar Hasidim are differently cohesive to Chabad Hasidim. And in fact, very often, if you try to marry across that barrier, there'll be blocks getting in the way. So even with the ultra-Orthodox world, there are problems. In other words, we don't like to admit it, but the fact is, we now live in a world of individuality. And this, to my mind, is the great gift of the era we're in. Not in the sense that we don't care about anything else, but in the sense that we have choices. We have options to make. We can become more religious, we become less religious. We can choose to do more mitzvot, we choose to do less mitzvot. The truth is, everybody chooses. Everybody chooses which customs to adopt and which ones not to adopt. And we compromise one way or another all the time. And in fact, that's not a bad thing. Halakha is the law. But any rabbi will tell you, when somebody comes to me with a problem, I have to take into consideration the personal circumstances, the personal challenges, the difficulties that that person may have. And so, in a sense, although the law is very clear as mishpat, the law, there's also a concept of tzedakah that we have to be understanding and sympathetic and apply halakha to the specific condition rather than generalized. So I'm making a plea for tolerance, if you like, for understanding, if you like, but to appreciate that there are so many different ways of finding a way to God, so many different ways of finding yourself to a Jewish way of life. And the important thing in the end is to try. In fact, the Gemara makes a fundamental difference between those people who break the law out of weakness and those people who break the law out of ideological objection. Those people who doubt and those people who certainly don't believe. And there is room for all of us to fall into the category of what I would call honest questioners. But not everybody wants to question. And there's no problem with that. The problem is only that when somebody feels alienated or somebody feels this is not for me, and one wants to bring them back in to feel more committed, this in fact involves looking at that person as an individual and finding a solution to that individual that suits that individual. So we can explain everything in the Torah, in a sense, as Maimonides tries to rationally, why these mitzvot are given and what their function is. And on the other hand, we can look at it mystically and simply look at it from a non-rational point of view. And so when we start off reading the Torah and saying, Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning God created, what did God create? What was the beginning? What's the difference between Rosh and Tchilah? What's the difference between an evolutionary process and a Big Bang theory? The interesting thing is that the Gemara in Chagiga, and this is my last point before we go over to discussion and argument, the Gemara in Chagiga essentially says this. Why was the Torah created with the letter Bet? The letter Bet is closed on top, closed behind, closed below, but open going forward. In other words, the function of Torah is to get us how to live our lives. But we all go forward in our own way. The Gemara Mishnah also goes on to say that somebody who wants to look at what's above, what's below, what's behind, is missing the point of life. And he goes on to say there are certain topics that you need to discuss with intellectuals, and you need to discuss in small numbers so that the response can be tailored to your particular needs. It is not against asking questions. It is concerned primarily with, are you committed? And if you are committed, you'll find your way and your solution. And the role of rabbis is to help you on that journey. And from what I hear about yours, he's doing a damn fine job.
Thanks.
So,
yeah.
Questions?
Please, thank you so much. Please, if you can type your questions on the chat, and hopefully we'll open a nice discussion over here. Please do so. Let me just put everyone over here 1 second. Usually the first ones, people are shy for the first questions, and then it comes in coming in. But if you have a question, please type on in the chat room, and I will point out the question. Very good. Just write this over here. So before we get the questions, what was relationship with Rabbi Shapira? How do you remember? Do you remember conversations with Rabbi Moshe Shmuel Shapira? I didn't have the opportunity to meet Rabbi Volbe in my time. He already opened the new yeshiva later on, but Rabbi Shapira,
a young man of 16, brought up in England with a very poor Jewish education, even though it was in my father's own school. And I was not doing as well as I should have been doing. I've always been a little bit of a naughty boy. And so at the age of 16, my father packed me off to this yeshiva in Israel because, as I said, he'd been in Mir with Rav Shapiro and with Rav Volba, and they did him a favor. And they took me in because by any standards, I should not have been accepted to study there. And Shapiro had not seen my father since he left Mir in 1938, because then war broke out. My father came back to England. Rav Shapiro with Mir was evacuated. And when he saw me, he put his hand upon me and he said, Hashem yochnecha b'ni, which is the famous bracha that Yaakov gave when he saw Binyamin coming to him in Egypt. In other words, this was this kind of bracha that, you know, sort of, I never thought I'd see you or see the result of my Chavrusa's family. And shortly afterwards, my father actually came to Israel on a brief visit, and he gave a shiur in Mir to everybody who was there. So there was this personal interest. Rav Shapiro was opposite to Rav Volba. He was vibrant, he was alive, he had a twinkle in his eye, he was always laughing, he was absolutely brilliant. Rav Wolbe was somber, a little bit more Germanic, a little bit serious. And the Shiva was split between those who focused on learning brilliantly with Rav Shapiro and those who were more inclined to be Hasidim of Rav Wolbe and focus on the Musa. And Musa was very important. It was Musa that changed me from being a wild, out of control young man. I suddenly had this beginnings of some discipline. Obviously, they would say they didn't go far enough, but it certainly had an impact on me. And the difference between the two is reflected in this way. On Purim, we always had to go out and raise money for the yeshiva, which is something I hated doing. And after we'd raised money for the yeshiva, we'd come back at Rav Shapiro, and the two of them lived together in two cottages next to each other, built on steps, pretty primitive, very primitive it was. And Rav Shapiro invited you in to his Suda, and then you went next door to Rav Wolbe to his Suda. When I came into Rav Shapiro's, there was mashka, there was drink, he was lively, he was laughing, he was having a good time. I had a wonderful time there, and I come down from there and I go across to Rav Wolbe and go into Rav Wolbe, and it's very serious, very, very serious. There's a little bit of cherry brandy on the table, and he's dishing out small little drops of cherry brandy. I was already quite lively, and in this situation, I decided to sneak some more. And I snuck some more under cover around the corner to the point where, unfortunately, I was so high that when I came to leave, I fell down the steps and landed in a heap at the bottom. And Rav Wolbe came down and he picked me up and he says, you must learn from this that there is simcha and there is simcha. There is a simcha of Torah and there is the simcha of Musa. Both of them are very different. But the one thing neither of them has any interest in is tipshus, being an idiot. So I want you to learn not to be a tippish.
Fantastic story. Thank you. Fantastic. We have someone is asking or saying, I love you, Jeremy Moore, but I don't think it's a question. I think it's just a statement, correct? You can unmute yourself because I don't think it's a question.
Okay. First of all, hello. I have this, and I'm amazed when I've seen you how much like your dad you look.
Oh, that's very kind of you. I don't think so. My brother David does. My brother David very much. But anyway, thank you for the compliment. I can't think of a nicer one.
Okay. The point I think I was making was that actually much of what we are is born out of a sense of community.
Yeah.
So there is a feeling, a need to belong. And from that comes whatever level of observance you want to be, because it's quite difficult to imagine a Jew living in isolation by himself, because at that point, what do you relate to? So I think it was Tom Lehrer that once said he was Jewish by delicatessen. So I think from which I knew what he meant. I think many of us are Jewish by by our habits, by our education, by our feeling. And in terms of what you're saying, do you regard that actually as a springboard from which you develop some other thoughts or whatever?
Look, I do not like categorizing Jews at all. Anyway, only God can judge. One doesn't know what goes on inside a person. And there are different ways of expressing your Judaism through charity, not necessarily through religion or what have you. And you are right. We need community. We need community to give us a sense of belonging and cohesion. And yet communities are difficult things. There's a famous in C.S. Lewis's Screw Tape Letters. I don't know if any of you have managed to ever read that, but they are letters between senior devil and junior devil on how to corrupt a good Christian. And junior devil sends a letter to senior devil and says, look, I'm having trouble. My Christian is going into church and he quite likes it. And I'm worried that if he gets used to this, I'll have to do something about it. And Senior Devil sends back and says, listen, easy to solve this problem. Next time he's in church feeling something, just get him to think about the butcher to the right who didn't give him a nice cut of meat, the garage keeper who didn't do a good job on his car. As soon as you can get him to think of the people around, it'll ruin any spiritual effect there can possibly be. And that's something I think most of us have experienced. I've certainly experienced being in a shul and surrounded by people who either get on my nerves, or they're busybodies, or they're minding my business, or whatever it is, and they want to gossip, and they want to chat, and it ruins the atmosphere. But community is necessary because we need community support. And the trouble is that community support can sometimes be overwhelming. It so happens that last week, my son here in New York came across a 16-year-old Satmara Chassid with his payas dangling down, riding his bike in Wall Street. And he said to him, what are you doing around here? He said, I've been kicked out of school. Why have you been kicked out of school? Because I want to study secular things. I'm not happy with this. I want to do something else, and they won't let me, and I'm making trouble. And here you have the problem that a Hasidic community, or any closely knit community, has tremendous benefits. It's warmth, it gives you support, it looks after you if anything goes wrong. It's very, but to belong to it, you have to belong lock, stock, and barrel. And if you don't, you're lost. And the problem is there are people who leave these closed communities because they're not built that way. And instead of rejecting them, we have to find ways of giving them somewhere to belong, but maybe in a less hot atmosphere, in a different kind of an atmosphere. And therefore, in simple answer to you, we are different, each one of us. And we have to find the context that works for us. I believe that the greatness of Torah is that fundamentally it's a way of life rather than a theological institution or theological system. It's how you live that really counts. Lo hamidrashikar ela hamaseh, it's action that matters. I'm not saying belief doesn't matter. There aren't fundamentals. These are fundamentals, are guides. They're guides to tell us there's more to this world than we think of. There are many different dimensions, not only those we're used to. But it is subjective. And I want to, if you like, celebrate the subjectivity rather than try to squash it by forcing it into a very confined area. Does that answer the question? Not really.
Yeah, I don't think, frankly, there is a straight answer, because at the end of it, the answer is, do you feel comfortable? Do you belong? If you feel comfortable and you belong, what happens, happens. People change their minds, their views, circumstances change them, because we respond to external stimuli.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Oh dear. Right.
Stuart Soloway.
Stuart Soloway. I would rephrase your question, if that's okay, because
no, don't.
Well, it's not a question. What's the question then?
It is a question. I said I love your approach. You've got it in front of you. You can read it. Is it compatible with the United Synagogue? Put it that way.
When I was in the rabbinate in Glasgow in the late 60s, before I, in the early 70s, went to Carmel, I was invited down to a conference of the United Synagogue under the auspices of the Chief Rabbi to discuss the future of the United Synagogue. And at this conference, I gave a paper in which I said, big synagogues are not for everybody. Chazanut is not for everybody. Rabbis are not for everybody. The role of the United Synagogue should be a kind of a holding company and an umbrella organization in which it should be offering variety. Some people like to daven quickly. I happen to prefer a shtibel, right? Chazanut for me is fine in a concert hall. I don't want it to get in the way of my davening in shul. And sometimes, frankly, I don't like to hear rabbis talking, because a lot of the time they don't talk very much sense. And I want to have the choice. And so I like things like alternative minyanim. And I like things like a Kiddush minyan. These things are heretical in some sense, situations, but I like variety, and I think the idea forward should have been for synagogues to offer varieties within the framework. But there are problems with it. Oh, you're taking people away from the main auditorium, you're insulting the rabbi, you're doing this, you're doing that. Everybody has a good reason, or this isn't kosher enough, or that's not kosher. And it's a shame. I believe United Synagogue could offer this. I believe that's what United Synagogue should be offering it. And if it offered that, all those things competing with it, whether it's Masorti or Reform or whatever it is, they would not have the same leg to stand on. I think it's a shame. I was laughed out of court. I was ignored because that's the United Synagogue, which is one of the reasons why I never took a job in the United Synagogue. My synagogue in Glasgow was independent. But
can I ask a supplementary? Doesn't your approach lead to the cult of the rabbi? In other words, you actually become the follower of a rabbi who suits you.
Well, that is happening. I mean, that's happening, but it doesn't have to. On the contrary, in many of these cases, people don't need the rabbi, and they function perfectly well without the rabbi. The rabbi is a facility there if they need it. Rabbis are brilliant at being pastoral. They meet the pastoral need, if not the intellectual need. You might say Chabad are very good at that. So there are all these different options. In fact, there are many more options we now have in England than we ever had before. When I was growing up as a young man, Chabad was only in Stamford Hill. There was no Chabad outside. And you've got these alternatives that are even stricter if you want to go to Stamford Hill, to Satmar or Bells or Ger or any of these. So some people like, particularly actually in the Sephardi community, they like rabbis to tell them exactly what to do and solve their problems and give them a bracha and give them a blessing and everything will be fine and we'll all live happily ever after. Some people like that and some people need it. But not everybody does. And I think offering variety empowers people to choose what works best for them. And so you might have somebody, for example, I've often come across this, people who can't bear to talk to the rabbi in shul, but love to talk to him somewhere else, and vice versa.
Just before we're going to the next question, and then we'll see if there's any more questions. Just to mention on what you just said, do you think that giving the varieties and giving options today is maybe the problem of this millennium? Because one might say giving too many options without educating the person in a specific direction can be the issue itself. So yes, chanoch lanaar lefi darko, you have to educate each person with his uniqueness, but you need to educate and not give an option for them to choose ABC, which they choose, and you're not directing them to any choice. So coming back to the synagogue or the hub, giving many options to the pupil is not really directing them, one might say.
There's a difference between giving so many options you get confused and giving direction. And there's a difference between an educational system that encourages questioning to an educational system that shuts out questioning. Yeah. And that's the biggest problems in the Haredi world, that a kid who doesn't fit in, there's no option for him. And he's got nowhere to go for a school if he doesn't fit in the conventional structure. So I believe, of course, you have to teach, and you have to give content, and you have to give direction, but it should be on the basis of accepting that not everybody fits into the same mold. So that's principle number one that I think is very important. Principle number two is that there are options that we see all the time. People become frummer, people become less frum, people who go from one Hasidic Rebbe to another, to a different dynasty, and they change all the time. So we actually see around us this vibrancy. And I actually think that that is what has made Jewish life in the diaspora, let alone Israel, much stronger than it was. Jewish life, Yiddishkeit in London, in North London, is fantastically more intense and powerful than it ever was in the old days of the 1950s, when the biggest synagogue was the Hendon United, in which half the members, after shul on the Shabbos, went to play football or watch football or go out for lunch in town and so forth. There was, in those days, so-called orthodoxy was very wishy-washy. It had very little content. Things have changed dramatically in Anglo-Jewry over the years, as they have in America. Now, it's true, the other side of the coin is the assimilation rate is phenomenal. They've gone way out in the other area. But you look at America, it's true, the vast majority of Americans 50 years ago were Reform. And within a short period of time, from being the most powerful, strongest, they're still numerically the greatest number in America, their influence has dwindled and dwindled and dwindled. Are staggeringly weak. On the other hand, the Haredi world, phenomenal, hundreds of thousands, new Haredi cities being built in New Jersey, in New York, upstate. It's doing incredibly well. There's always a price. But I think having a free, open market has proved much healthier with less antagonism than, for example, you have in Israel, where the connection of the rabbinate with state and religion and state has created a lot of ill feeling and a lot of antagonism. You don't have that antagonism here, but it's true, you have a much worse rate of assimilation. And sadly, when most Israelis who are secular come to America, they marry out and they disappear. And that's the tragedy. But
can I make a point, please?
Duality, we have become stronger, not weaker.
Norman, just before, the point, Norman, just to say that Ian Patterson wrote down, where is the limits of the proposition of a rabbi advising a member of his community basically to adjust on his context and his circumstance? Where is that limit? Where do you think is the limit of that rabbi? Sorry?
There are two kinds of limits. Two kinds here. One of them, I'll tell you, is another thing. Before I left Mir, I turned to Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, and I said to him, Rosh Yeshiva, I'm going out to work primarily in a non-committed Jewish environment where people are not shomer mitzvot. And sometimes I want to be lenient. I want to know what are the limits of my leniency. To which he replied, the limits of your leniency are this. If you can find two reliable Rishonim, rabbis living during the medieval and late medieval period, who agree with your position, you may take that position as an individual, giving an individual advice. So what I'm saying and what he is saying is this. Halakha is halakha. The Constitution is the Constitution. The Constitution can only change through constitutional methods. You can't change the American Constitution without the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court isn't just any Tom, Dick, and Harry. It's experts who know inside out the law and what's involved. There are disagreements, but they're working within the framework of the law. So there is, on the one hand, if you like, the consistency of the Constitution, of Torah, of halakha. And halakha is the safeguard. And anybody who tries to undermine that is, in my view, taking the wrong path. There's a difference between saying this is wrong and difference saying I just can't do it, or it's just not working for me. And so when the rabbi is faced with a problem, I think he has to inform about what the halakha is, and then he makes an individual decision of a different kind. And I'll give you an example of this. An example of this, which is, most rabbis will not agree with me about this, but it's in a case where a quadriplegic comes to me and he says, I have found a nurse who wants to live with me and take care of me and be with me and support me. She's not Jewish. What should I do? Now, there's no question he shouldn't marry her. There's no such thing as marriage, right? And I will tell him there's no such thing as marriage. But my advice to you, young man, is take advantage of it. If it's civil marriage, that's going to be up to you. I can't give you kiddushin, but I can certainly give you the advice that will enable you to live more reasonably in the situation in which you find yourself in. Now, of course, I wouldn't make that as a general rule. And I wouldn't say that is the law. It isn't. But sometimes you are faced with that kind of decision.
Thank you very much, Norman.
Yeah, I just want to say,
the last one, please.
First of all, good evening. I'm really not quite sure what's going on about your United Synagogue, where you say there should be diversity within United Synagogue. The whole purpose of United Synagogue is that they are united in what they're doing. They've got a track on which to run. If you want to actually have diversity within the United Synagogue, then you're no longer united, because if that being the case, you can actually be this to the right, this to the left, this to the center. You're no longer united. Therefore, you can't have a united synagogue with diversity within it. But you've already got the diversity with the liberal, the reform, the Haredim, the conservatives, etc. You've already got that diversity. So why create diversity within a united area where they at least got some form of being united? Therefore, I don't understand your question.
Of any united synagogue in which all the members agree on anything. What do you mean by united? United, like Manchester United, is just a name, right?
No, united. What I mean by united is that they're running along a single track. In other words, this is how they're going to behave. This is
track. Is single track Chabad track?
It doesn't matter, because once you start to diverse within the united track, then you become Chabad. You then become conservative. You then become Haredim. So therefore,
right.
Why change it?
Okay, so here's an example of where we're using words differently. You're using it as a label, and I'm using it to express variety within the framework.
Could I just say one more thing in that case? I mean, with respect. The Meseles Yeshoel says, a person should find out what his purpose is in his world, not in the world in general. So you've already got diversity within the person. The person has got his own diversity.
But what I'm saying is, some people like a chazan, and some people don't like a chazan. Some people like long services, some people like short services. Give them a choice.
That's their prerogative. That's exactly why people in the United Synagogue go to the Chabad. They've already got that choice. Therefore, they move away because the United Synagogue isn't providing what they want.
Why don't the United Synagogue provide what they want, and they'll keep their membership within?
Anyway, thank you very much. That's it could be continued.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Aviva. If you want to close the session, but I just want to say, on my point of view, I think, Rabbi, first of all, it is a pleasure to have you here, and I think our community is very unique, because although many of us might not have the background as so religious as the Haredi community, but we are thirsty for diversity in thoughts and ideas, and we love to hear your thoughts. I might not agree personally, whatever, with all what you said, but that's a typical Jew, and that's exactly what you are saying, and that's what the beauty about it. And discussions is important. It's a little bit hard to do it on Zoom with writing down and hearing each other. But as I said, again, thank you so much for shouting out from the other side of the pond. And I hope we have an opportunity to continue to hear from you. And voila, I will pass it over to Aviva.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So again, I'd just like to thank all our attendees. Rabbi Rosen, it's not like the lockdown university. We're not in the thousands in Northwood. We have a small community. You had a third of our community listening to you on a Sunday night, which is possibly a record. And it was fascinating and very thought-provoking. And I'm sure we'll all be thinking about it and actually talking about it between ourselves over the coming weeks. So thank you again for giving up your afternoon for us. And I very much hope you'll be able to come and talk again.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
May you go from